the heart of a bustling city, where wealth and poverty collide at every corner, a desperate billionaire rushed his frail, disabled son out of a hospital that had already given up hope. Doctors shook their heads, papers were signed, and whispers filled the sterile halls. Nothing more can be done. Yet fate had other plans. Outside those doors, on the cold pavement where people rarely looked twice, sat a poor, blind beggar. To most he was invisible, just another forgotten soul. But what happened when their worlds collided would shake the city in ways no one could have imagined. The city never truly slept. Skyscrapers glowed with endless lights, while narrow alleys echoed with the shuffle of forgotten lives. In one of those towers lived Richard Halden, a billionaire whose empire stretched across continents. He was a man used to buying solutions, silencing problems with money, and bending fate in his favor. But money, for the first time, had betrayed him. His only son, Daniel, born with a rare disability, had been in and out of hospitals since childhood. Doctors, specialists, and experimental treatments all had been exhausted. The sterile smell of hospital corridors had become Richard's second home. Yet no amount of wealth could mend the fragile body of his boy. That morning, when the chief physician delivered the cold truth that Daniel would not survive much longer, Richard's heart collapsed in ways his fortune could not repair. So, against every medical warning, he carried his son out of the hospital. Not in anger, but in desperation, perhaps in denial, perhaps in hope. For once, the mighty man walked the same streets as the ordinary, cradling a child who was fading with each breath. People stared, not at his pain, but at the contrast. The billionaire stripped of his aura, reduced to a grieving father. On those very streets, life moved indifferently. Cars roared, vendors shouted, and the poor lined the sidewalks. Among them sat an old blind beggar. His clothes were torn, his hands calloused, and a small tin cup rattled with the occasional coin tossed his way. He was invisible to the city, someone people avoided with quick steps and lowered eyes. Yet fate was pulling threads, drawing the billionaire and the beggar toward a collision that neither wealth nor blindness could have predicted. Richard walked aimlessly through the streets, holding his fragile son in his arms. Daniel's breathing was shallow, each gasp sounding like a clock ticking toward the inevitable. The billionaire had never felt so powerless. People who once bowed in respect now avoided his eyes. Some even whispered cruelly as they passed. It wasn't sympathy he received, but judgment. Judgment that his wealth couldn't shield him from anymore. Then, as he paused on the sidewalk, his gaze caught the figure of an old blind beggar seated near a crumbling wall. The beggar's milky eyes stared at nothing, but his face carried a strange calmness, as if he knew suffering in a way no one else could. A sign rested near his feet, scrawled in uneven letters. Blind, but still alive. God bless the forgotten. Richard had never noticed him before. Men like him were often invisible, until life forced you to see. And at that moment, Daniel stirred faintly in his father's arms. The billionaire sat beside the beggar, lowering himself to the cold ground. It was a sight that shocked passers-by. The richest man in the city sharing space with one who owned nothing. The beggar tilted his head slightly as though he sensed the presence of pain. "A child?" he asked softly, though his eyes saw nothing. Richard said nothing, yet his silence told more than words. The beggar's weathered hands reached forward, trembling until they gently touched the boy's fragile arm. To Richard's surprise, Daniel did not resist. What happened next unsettled him. The beggar began to hum, a low, broken tune, almost like a prayer. The sound wasn't beautiful, but it carried weight. as if born from decades of suffering. And Daniel, who had been slipping away all day, suddenly seemed calmer. His breathing steadied. His small hand twitched, clutching his father's shirt. Richard's heart raced. Could this ragged man, whom the world dismissed as worthless, offer something no doctor, no hospital, and no fortune ever had? He wanted to believe it was a coincidence, but deep down, desperation made him cling to the impossible. As he watched, however, something else became clear. People walking by began to stare, not at the child but at Richard himself. Their eyes narrowed, their whispers sharpened. The sight of a wealthy white billionaire sitting beside a blind black beggar stirred ridicule. Some scoffed, others sneered as if this act of desperation was shameful, laughable. "Look at him," someone muttered, loud enough to be heard. "Crawling to a beggar now. His money couldn't save his own kind." It was racism, classism, cruelty, all disguised as casual mockery. Richard felt their stares burn his skin, but for once he didn't move. Pride had no place here. His son was still alive, still breathing. Because of this man they mocked. And though Richard had never lived a day knowing what it meant to be judged for his skin, in that moment he tasted the venom of society's disdain. The beggar ignored it all. His rough fingers traced the boy's hand gently, and his whisper carried the strength of someone who had seen too much suffering. "Every life has meaning," he murmured, "even those the world forgets." Richard's throat tightened. For the first time in years he felt small, not in wealth, but in humanity. And as Daniel's weak chest rose and fell with a steadier rhythm, Richard knew the city would never understand what was happening here. But he also knew this night was far from over. Night fell heavily over the city, and the streets thinned as neon lights flickered to life. Richard remained seated on the cold pavement, clutching his son while the blind beggar sat beside him. Hours had passed, yet Daniel still breathed, fragile, but steadier than before. For a father who had been told to prepare for death, this was nothing short of a miracle. But miracles in this world rarely came without a cost. A small crowd had gathered nearby, drawn not by compassion but by curiosity and contempt. Phones were raised, flashes of cameras lit the air, and laughter rippled as images of the billionaire cradling his son beside a ragged black beggar were captured and shared. "The mighty has fallen," someone sneered. Another voice spat, "That's what happens when you think your kind is above ours." Richard's jaw tightened, anger and shame colliding in his chest. He had spent a lifetime in luxury, guarded from society's venom. Still tonight he was being stripped bare in the most public way possible. Still, as he looked at his son's faint smile, something he hadn't seen in weeks, his pride dissolved. Let them laugh. Let them hate. He would not move. The beggar, however, sensed the hostility. Though blind, he heard the cruel words, the mocking laughter, the shifting of feet too close. His thin body trembled, not with fear, but with something deeper, a weary strength forged from decades of being spat on, ignored, treated as less than human. For once he was not invisible. For once the world was watching. And then it happened. Daniel's small body convulsed, his breathing sharp and ragged. Panic seized Richard's chest. This was the moment the doctors had warned of. He clutched his son tighter, helpless tears blurring his vision. But the beggar lifted his hands again, resting them gently on the boy's fragile frame. His lips moved in prayer, raw and trembling, words not meant for the crowd, but for something greater. The noise around them faded, the laughter stilled, and in the silence that followed, Daniel's chest steadied once more. He did not die. Against every medical prediction, the boy breathed, weak, but alive. The crowd, stunned, had no words. For the first time, even Richard forgot the wealth he once thought was power. Because in that fragile heartbeat it was the blind beggar who had done what no one else could. The night grew quieter, though the weight of what had just unfolded lingered in the air. The crowd that once mocked now dispersed in uneasy silence, some shaken, others unwilling to acknowledge what they had witnessed. Richard remained where he was, tears streaking his face, holding his son who, against all odds, still clung to life. The beggar lowered his trembling hands and leaned back against the wall, his breath shallow but steady. He asked for nothing, no praise, no thanks. For him, it was enough to offer what little strength he had. In his blindness, he had seen something greater than the world around him, the simple truth that every soul, no matter how forgotten, carried value. Richard finally found his voice, hoarse with emotion. But when he turned to speak, he realized the beggar had no interest in recognition. His face carried the weary peace of someone who had given all he could. And perhaps that was the greatest gift, an act born not of wealth, not of privilege, but of pure humanity. As dawn broke, Richard stood, his son still in his arms. For the first time, he looked at the beggar not with pity but with reverence. He left quietly, carrying more than just his child. He had a lesson that no fortune could buy, a lesson about dignity, resilience, and the unseen strength of those the world steps over every day. In the weeks that followed, whispers of that night spread. Some dismissed it as a rumor, others called it luck, and a few even mocked it as desperation. But Richard knew the truth. And though he never revealed the beggar's name, perhaps because he never learned it, he made a silent vow to live differently, to see differently. Because in a world divided by wealth, by race, by the cruel weight of judgment, it was not the billionaire or the doctors who gave Daniel another chance. It was the blind beggar, the man society scorned, who reminded everyone that humanity itself is the greatest power of all. And the question lingers: how many lives do we overlook each day, never realizing they hold the answers we seek?